Hi, I'm John Hull. I teach in the business school at the University of Toronto. It's called the Rahman School of Management. And my area of expertise is derivatives of risk management.
Mr. Hull, thank you very much for being here. My first question would be, derivatives is a word that commands a lot of respect and fear. Everybody thinks it must be very good, but it's highly complex. Especially corporations that are very hesitant to use these instruments in our environment. Banks use them, and they have the people trained for that. Every now and then you hear about companies that have run into trouble for using derivatives and not knowing how to use it. What can you tell us about the state of risk management on derivatives nowadays?
Well, Jerry, you're right. As there have been a lot of very well-publicized disasters associated with derivatives, but we have to realize that derivatives are a huge multi-trillion dollar market. And most of the time when people trade derivatives, they're doing it for sensible reasons, and we don't hear anything about it because it works out well and they reduce risk. I think corporations in the United States and Canada are probably a little bit more comfortable with derivatives than in Mexico, but I expect that will change. And I expect that Mexican companies will become much more comfortable with derivatives as time passes. One thing it's important to bear in mind is that when a company hires somebody to hedge its risk using derivatives, it's really important to monitor what that person is doing. There's always a danger with derivatives, and this is how many of the major disasters happen. Somebody starts off, they're recruited by a company, maybe recruited from one of the banks by a company to hedge risks. And they do that for a while, and then over time they sort of move from being a hedger to a speculator, and nobody actually notices what's going on. And of course, then things start to go wrong, and they double up, and we have a disaster. So it's really important to monitor what the trader who's using derivatives to hedge risk, what that trader is actually doing. And of course, you've got to start by actually quantifying what the risks are, and then looking at what the best strategy is to quantify these risks. So I think the danger is that companies don't monitor what a trader is doing.
Yes. You have talked about the increasing new regulation that is coming up. Rather than talking about it's too much or too little, the basic point from financial perspective is does it make markets more efficient? If we believe in efficient markets hypothesis, is it going to work? Is it really going to help us prevent other crises?
Well, I think derivatives markets have always been reasonably efficient. So I wouldn't say efficiency was necessarily the key aim. But if we think about derivatives markets, there's two, as everybody knows, there's two different derivatives markets, and the exchange-traded derivatives market and the over-the-counter derivatives market. The over-the-counter derivatives market has, over the years, become a lot bigger than the exchange-traded derivatives market. And up to the crisis, it was largely unregulated. So I could get on the phone with you and do a deal. It would just be a deal between you and me. Nobody would know about it except the two of us, and we would have a master agreement in place to manage that and other deals that we've done between ourselves. Largely as a result of the credit crisis, that was sort of 2007, 2008, 2009, that's all changing. And we're seeing regulations for the over-the-counter derivatives market. But I wouldn't actually say efficiency was the prime objective of the regulations. It'd be nice if the markets became more efficient. I think what the regulators want is the markets to become more transparent so that people can see what what trades are being done. I mean, the regulators never want to be confronted by another AIG situation. AIG was the big insurance company in the United States that wrote credit derivatives contracts that insured AAA-rated products that were created from subprime mortgages. And of course, we know a lot of those AAA-rated products went south and cost AIG a lot of money, and then cost the US taxpayer a lot of money when AIG had to be bailed out. But the key thing there is nobody had any idea that AIG was always on one side of that particular trade. It was always writing protection against these securities created from mortgages, from residential mortgages in the US. So one of the prime objectives, I think, is transparency. They want to know what trades are being done. What we're seeing is the creation of swap execution facilities in the US. We're seeing the creation of central clearing parties for standardized over-the-counter derivatives. And we're seeing much more collateral in the system. And we're seeing central registers. So, I mean, obviously, if a trade goes through a central clearing party, then, then it will be known about. This will be no secret. But if you and I, there will still be some trades which are done, like the trade I was describing earlier, between you and me, that nobody else knows about because it's not a standard trade. It's not a trade that can go through the central clearing party. But we will be required to register that trade with a central register, which was different from the situation before. So transparency and basically also dealing with the systemic risk that over-the-counter derivatives markets cause. That's the other big objective, I think. The danger is that one bank, such as Lehman's, goes under. It's got a lot of derivatives contracts outstanding with other banks. Those banks suffer because Lehman defaults on their contracts. They make losses, they have derivatives with other banks, and it sort of creates a ripple effect through the whole system. And one bank failing leads to other banks failing. This was the big concern with AIG, incidentally, and that's why the government bailed out AIG, because AIG had so many contracts with banks, and those banks would have made big losses if AIG had defaulted on those contracts. So one way in which trying to deal with the systemic risk problem is to require banks to post more collateral and channel their trades through central clearing parties, which are really very much like exchange clearing houses. And so you could say in many ways, the over-the-counter derivatives market has become much more like the exchange traded derivatives market. I mean, the swap execution facilities, which are part and parcel with the Dodd-Frank Act in the US, are very much like exchanges, and the central clearing parties are very much like exchange clearing houses. So I would say, what's really happening is that we're forcing the over-the-counter market to a large extent to become more like the exchange-traded market, with an attendant increase in collateral, which should reduce the systemic risk.
Two final questions. Your book has run now into its 10th edition.
Well, I think not quite a 10th edition yet. We'd have to wait a few years for that. It's the Options, Futures, and Other Derivatives book is in its 8th edition now. I'll be working on the 9th edition next year.
So it leads me to the next question. How far are derivatives going to go? How can we expect to see in the years to come?
Well, it would be nice to write a book about something which never changes. Let me think. I mean, if I wrote a book about calculus, for example, that sort of seems to stay much the same one year to the next. But my book actually was I don't know whether you ever saw the first edition of the book, but that was a pretty thin volume. It was, about 300 pages. It's now grown to 800 pages. And it's tried to keep pace with all the changes we've seen in derivatives markets. Recent changes, of course, have been the ones I've just been outlining, the move to central clearing parties and the over-the-counter markets becoming more like exchange-traded markets. What's next? I think some of the more exotic products that we've seen in Europe and North America are disappearing from the market. I think there's a tendency for quants who are highly mathematically well trained to move from pricing really exotic instruments to moving into risk management and worrying about how we can quantify counterparty credit risk, how we can quantify market risk, and that sort of thing. I think we will see, what derivatives are all about, of course, is transferring risk in the economy. And so I think people who work in the derivatives area are very creative, so they can continue to look for new risks to transfer. I wouldn't like to speculate on what those risks are, but I'm sure we will see development of risks. Robert Merton actually had an interesting idea, which is that countries should trade derivatives, not just companies. So that if country A is exporting oil but importing some other commodity, then there's a natural derivative transaction that company could enter into to protect itself against changes in the relative prices of oil and whatever the other product is that it's importing. So, who knows? I think that's an idea that's been around for a while, but it hasn't taken off.
And finally, you are a professor. I'm a professor as well. And I remember 2 years ago, the only guys that concerned themselves with derivatives were the finance guys. Now I have, in the university where I teach, they just had a derivatives course, and there were guys from marketing, from international business. Derivatives are going beyond the area of...
You started off in finance yourself? Yeah. That's certainly true. I thought I wouldn't have sort of chosen marketing and international business as the obvious ones, but of course the field is increasingly being taken over by math departments, and of course a lot of the derivatives, your masters of mathematical finance type of courses are being offered by maths departments rather than business schools and finance areas. So, when I started out, it was business schools that were, and I still work for a business school, of course, that were doing most of the work in derivatives. And most people who wrote papers in derivatives, if you think about it, in the sort of 1970s and at least the first half of the 1980s, were in business schools. And then slowly other disciplines got involved. I think what I see happening actually in my business school is that derivatives are taught at a lot earlier stage now to students. So when they come, they learn about derivatives on the core course in finance. They don't have to wait till they get to the electives. And so, which is kind of nice in a way because they already know a lot of the basics by the time I get to teach them an elective in derivatives. As far as marketing and international business is concerned, maybe that's a Mexican phenomenon. I haven't seen that in Canada, but it's certainly, it's a sign of success, that so many other disciplines are interested.
Would you encourage any business student to go into derivatives, to learn derivatives? Not necessarily that they're going to practice derivatives, that they understand it?
Yeah, no, there's a number of different types of students out there. I mean, there's the ones who have got really good quantitative backgrounds and can judge the sort of high-tech, highly quantitative end of the business. Now, I don't tend to actually teach those students that much because they tend to come through the math departments these days. The business school students that I teach are generally are more generalists. So my sales pitch for my course on derivatives is that what you've got to do is to learn to talk the language of the quants. I'm not actually going to teach you to be a quant. I mean, there might be a small number of students who've got the right background to actually become very good at this sort of work, and there have been 1 or 2 over the years. But most of the students I teach, what they're really getting out of my course is the ability to communicate with quants. Because I mean, this is and not only with quants, of course, but with other people in the financial institution and work, so they can act as intermediaries and make sure the quants are actually doing something that's useful for the organization. In Canada in particular, I think we've got lots of quants working for the banks, but the actual quantitative knowledge within the banks sort of kind of stops at the senior vice president level. Mm-hmm. And so there's a danger that those quants aren't sort of being well managed and doing things which are really useful for banks. So I think, an MBA graduate who understands the derivatives markets well enough to understand, when a quant talks about stochastic processes and DZs and embedded derivatives and all that sort of thing, talking the same language. I think that's a really useful skill.
Okay, Mr. Ball, as for question, that's all. I would only ask you for a few words of you're happy to be here, something like if you can mention the word charismatics is used for the testimonial. Uh-huh.
Yeah, no, I am happy to be here. I've known Alan Brash for a long time, and it's very nice of him to invite me here. Somebody was reminding me actually that my first visit to Mexico, in fact, was at the opening of derivatives markets 9 years ago in Mexico. I was invited down by the Mexican exchange. Then we started trading derivatives, and that was a great event. And I'm very pleased to be back in Mexico City again.